All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman, and today I am joined by Yahoo Sports and Reception Perceptions, Matt Harmon, and we're going to be talking all about the Falcons receiver group. We're going to talk about Drake London, Bryan Edwards, Kyle Pitts, and sort of anybody else that's sort of a fantasy radars heading into this 2022 season.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP, still going strong on Twitter at FalcFans, and of course, the host of this world-renowned Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family. And of course, Locked On Falcons is free and available Monday through Friday on a variety of podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, and of course on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to Locked On Falcons on YouTube, hit that bell, hit that like, and you will get the video version of the podcast the night before the audio drops. So today I am joined by another illustrious guest here on this world-renowned podcast, and that is Matt Harmon, making one of multiple appearances on this podcast. We get Matt on a lot. Matt is sort of my go-to source for fantasy news. I love his fantasy tiers. I haven't quite pulled it off when it comes to winning the championship the last couple of years, but I'm always in the Final Four. So I feel like one of these years I'll be able to figure it out just simply by following Matt's and basically basing my draft off of his fantasy tiers and whatnot. And that has led me to success. And hopefully, if you guys check out his stuff at Yahoo, you'll lead you to future success. But Matt, my friend, welcome back to the show.
Hey, I appreciate it, man. Yeah, I can help you get close. A little bit of luck's got to take you the rest of the way as it goes with fantasy football sometimes. But yeah, I've been coming on your shows for years. We've been following each other for a year, 8 years or something like that. At this point, it's been a long, long time. And it's funny, you think about the ways, like we've been talking about Falcons receivers on, probably this podcast and other podcasts before. The group has changed a lot. Now it's obviously completely different than like we would have been talking about Julio Jones and Calvin Ridley, not to get upset like right away, but just even 2 or 3 years ago, now it's a totally different group. And that's what makes it fun, like the constant evolution of these receiver cores and the way things change. So I'm excited to break these guys down today. It's a very fascinating, probably, even if not the most stacked with talent receiving group out there, it could be one of the most versatile and multiple groups because of the guys they have right now.
Well, we're not that far removed from a time in my life where I thought Kyle Pitts, Julio Jones, and Calvin Ridley were going to be this Falcons trio of weapons for many years to come. And, about 13 months ago, that got completely derailed on those plans. But, with the changing faces, let's talk about Drake London. And I want to get your thoughts on Drake London. I know you were one of the first people I saw that sort of compared London favorably with Michael Thomas, the Saints wide receiver. And I've sort of taken that comparison and run with it since the Falcons drafted him, talking about my perception that Drake London is potentially best suited, similar to Michael Thomas, of being that sort of big slot type of receiver. I'm curious, I've asked pretty much everybody that's come on this podcast over the last 2 months their thoughts on Drake London and where he fits as an outside receiver, an inside receiver, or sort of that deadly combination of both that you see in Michael Thomas.
Right. Yeah. Because Thomas, I think, is a guy who probably came into the league with those big slot expectations, but he's had his biggest years playing like as an X receiver on the perimeter. And I think Drake London could do that as well. I think that the deadly combination of both, as you said, it is probably the best fit for Drake London because, let's just get this out of the way now. Obviously, with what I do with reception perception, the main thing that I'm tracking is, wide receiver route running. Do they get open? Do they get separation? Drake London, despite being kind of the size, physical profile that he has and the amount of contested catches you see him win, he's still a guy that gets separation, is a guy that gets open, not necessarily. I think he's drawn comparisons, and I can see these comparisons in some way to a guy like Mike Evans, who's another one of these receivers who's a big guy who wins down the field, wins in a lot of contested situations, and people think that because of his size profile, he's not a great route runner or a guy that gets open. Mike Evans gets open. Okay. You don't, put a 1,000-yard season after 1,000-yard season after 1,000-yard season without getting open. So I think sometimes our brains can like fill in the blank information when you see a guy win a bunch of contested situations or even just be in a bunch of contested situations. We'll talk about a guy like Bryan Edwards who sort of kind of gets grouped into this as well. You think, oh, well, he must not be getting open. But if you ever struggle with the concept, a wide receiver can be a great route runner, can get separation, and still be in a lot of contested situations. And you want to see it from an NFL perspective, just check out Terry McLaurin last year, man. I mean, we know Terry McLaurin's one of the best route runners in the NFL, but he gets thrown into a lot of contested situations. You saw that a lot with Drake London at the college level. A few of these other receivers in this draft class as well would fit into that group. But yeah, I think the thing that's most fascinating about London from a separation perspective is he really is so smart at beating zone coverage underneath. You look at his route success rate chart and reception perception, absolutely elite scores on like the slant, the curl, the flat route. That is very obviously Michael Thomas-esque, which is why I think that comparison makes so much sense. Is I think he's just going to thump teams over and over and over again like Thomas does on those quick hitting routes, those layup routes, which, I think this Falcons offense is going to desperately need this year and for many years to come.
Now, you mentioned Bryan Edwards. I want to talk about Bryan Edwards and how he fits into this conversation alongside Drake London. We'll get into that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. But before we get there, I want to let listeners know and viewers know that today's episode is brought to you by Rock Auto. With ever increasing numbers of makes and models, it's now impossible for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts that you need. Why wait while the person behind the counter orders parts on their computer when you already have access to rockauto.com at home or in your pocket? Save time and money when using Rock Auto instead of spending up to twice as much for the same parts from a chain store or car dealership. Rock Auto is a family business serving do-it-yourselfers for over 20 years. They have reliably low prices for every single customer. They have everything you need from brake parts to tail lamps, motor oil, even new carpet. Just head on over to the easy to use website at rockauto.com. See all the parts available for your car or truck. And when you do, write Locked On in the How Did You Hear About Us box so that they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. So here with Matt Harmon of Yahoo Sports, breaking down, he does the reception perception stuff that he's already mentioned, breaking down these different receivers. I know you've done a little bit of work on Bryan Edwards in the past and sort of talking about his usage as that X wide receiver that has been a staple in the Arthur Smith offense and the Kyle Shanahan West Coast derivative offenses where we saw A.J. Brown in Tennessee, Julio Jones here in Atlanta. Do you sort of foresee a similar role for Bryan Edwards here in Atlanta as he had in Las Vegas as that X wide receiver? What are your thoughts on his potential fit in this Falcons offense?
Yeah, I think he can definitely be an X receiver. The thing that bothered me with his usage last year with the Las Vegas Raiders was he was basically a pure ISO ball receiver, like only lining up in that X receiver spot and mostly used as a vertical threat. Obviously, they had a tough situation there with Henry Ruggs, obviously, getting released from the team halfway through the year when he was obviously supposed to be the lid lifter. They sort of then tried to use, Zay Jones in that role. That didn't really work out. Bryan Edwards was pretty much just a jump ball receiver throughout the season. And that was weird because I thought coming into the year, in the offseason, he drew all these weird comparisons to like Randy Moss plus T.O. It was like the talk out of training camp there for the Raiders. That obviously did not materialize. And I think that was kind of crazy to ever expect that. To me, I thought the way that he would be best used was sort of like Derek Carr's new version of Michael Crabtree. You remember those early years with the Raiders where they had Amari Cooper and Michael Crabtree. Fantasy heads were almost always irritated that Michael Crabtree was consistently drawing these high target shares at the expense, quote unquote, of Amari Cooper. It's because Crabtree was that ultra reliable zone beating possession receiver, really good in contested situations. Derek Carr just kind of came to trust him in those roles where he was not really that trusting of Amari Cooper. And it made a lot of sense at the trajectory of those two guys' careers at that point. I thought Bryan Edwards would be best fit as like a possession receiver in that X spot. But again, that was never really the role that he held. So I think the Falcons taking a chance on him in that way does make a lot of sense because, you have a guy like Drake London who I think can line up as the X, the flanker, or that big slot receiver position. Edwards gives you a guy that can be a possession receiver in that role, while they try to sort of do some creative things, obviously with Kyle Pitts as well. Edwards is kind of the most like straightforward of this group, because I think obviously Kyle Pitts can line up at multiple spots. Drake London can line up at multiple spots. They have Cordero Patterson as sort of a hybrid running back, wide receiver, whatever the hell role he wants to play. Edwards is kind of the straightforward guy. And I think that he's not a great separator is Bryan Edwards, but I think he can be an average. You look at his rookie season in reception perception, right around kind of the 52nd, 50th percentile in success rate versus man zone coverage. But again, not really a guy that's going to give you that lid lifting presence. His best routes are sort of those intermediate patterns. And I think that's where the Falcons will need help the most. I think they probably have room, somewhere along obviously Kyle Pitts can be a vertical threat in certain ways. I think they could maybe use one more speed guy to really kind of complete this group. But I think that Edwards gives them a viable X receiver presence who, potentially can be the solid third option here in this passing game.
Yeah, I was curious what your thoughts were on, given that, as you mentioned, Bryan Edwards was primarily used as a vertical threat with Las Vegas. We know Drake London was very productive down the field due to that contested catch ability. We know Kyle Pitts certainly has that ability, but you kind of mentioned it, and that's been one of the things that to me is a concern that the Falcons will potentially have to address probably next offseason, is to get that sort of vertical threat down the field and generate those explosive plays. But do you think this group, this trio between Edwards, Drake London, Kyle Pitts, maybe sprinkles of Olamide Zaccheaus in there as well, who's made a couple plays in the past down the field, that these guys can give the Falcons enough in terms of that vertical presence that can threaten defenses this year?
I think Zaccheaus is going to be a key player just from the speed perspective, because none of these guys. I think they can make vertical plays. To answer the first part of the question, obviously, I think Drake London especially is a guy who can win on straight go routes on the outside because he is such a physical presence. I mean, we talk about this all the time with speed being a key part to being a vertical threat, but there's a lot of technicality that comes into it, a lot of technical ability that you need as a route runner. And I think Drake London has that. I think he's a very refined player. And you also, of course, need to be a dominant 50-50 ball receiver. And we know that that's Drake London's trump card trait. He was the best contested catch receiver in this year's class, based on my charting. So I think that he is going to be the key part of this. The primary function of Drake London, I think, will be as a layup receiver, a guy that wins on short routes, that wins on those crossing routes on play action that, Arthur Smith ideally would love to use in this offense. But from a vertical shot perspective, as an X receiver on straight up go routes, I think he can do that. But the key thing for making chunk plays is going to be over the middle with these guys, running seam routes, stuff like that. And I think all three of these players, especially Drake London and Kyle Pitts, can really be a key parts of that. But yeah, one real legitimate lid lifter would be great, just to kind of back off defenses a little bit. But I still think there can be big plays in this passing offense based on purely the design of the system and the way these guys can separate and win contested catches down the field.
Well, one of those guys that we're hoping to see create those explosive plays is Kyle Pitts. We'll get Matt's thoughts on Kyle Pitts and why he refuses to break down Kyle Pitts in reception perception. As we continue today's episode, we'll talk a little bit more about some other fantasy standouts. Probably we'll be talking about Cordero Patterson when we get to that part of the conversation. But we'll get Matt's thoughts on some of these other fantasy producers for the Falcons this season as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons, guys. But before we get there, I do want to plug the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family, where you can find 3 shows with 4 hosts giving you their perspective on the local teams as well as national sports. That's A to Z with Mark Zeno, Hitting Hard with John Chuckery, and ATL Day Ones with Jarvis Davis and Tanitra Batiste. Find them all on the same podcast feed on your preferred podcast platform, including on YouTube. And if you subscribe to Locked On Sports Atlanta on YouTube, you'll also be able to check out the Locked On Braves postcast, breaking down every Atlanta Braves win and loss this season, this summer, all the way to October. And guys, speaking of the Atlanta Braves, there's still a lot of sports going on. Even if the NBA season and the NHL seasons are over, there's still plenty of action available at betonline.net, the number one source for all your sports betting needs and info. Whether you're looking for the latest odds, contests, or player props, BetOnline has it all. This time of year is still great to go check out the action. If you want to put some action down on Wimbledon, Major League Baseball with those Atlanta Braves, you want to put NFL futures bets, Drake London, offensive rookie of the year, borrowing off of what Matt has talked about today. Kyle Pitts, MVP candidate out there. NBA prop bets, who's going to be the MVP next year, who's going to go to the finals, rookie of the year, who's going to win the Stanley Cup next year, all of that and more, along with UFC, boxing, esports, Vegas casino games. Find it all at betonline.net. BetOnline, where the game starts. So let's talk about Kyle Pitts. And sort of what are your expectations for Kyle Pitts going into year two? I kind of expect him to be the alpha in this Falcons passing offense. I'm expecting him to rack up significantly more targets, 120, 140, possibly more, be one of these elite tight ends in the same tier as Travis Kelce, Darren Waller that we've seen with their production in recent years. What are your expectations for Kyle Pitts heading into the season?
Yeah, Kyle Pitts, I mean, if he had scored 5 to 6 touchdowns, I think we'd be having a totally different conversation. There's some in fantasy that are disappointed by what they got out of his rookie season. It's like, give me a break. The guy goes over 1,000 yards at a position that is historically really like a slow burn position. Typically we see rookie tight ends take a long time. Sometimes tight ends don't even really get going until their second contract. So for what Kyle Pitts did, especially for the way that he did it, lining up outside a ton, just according to Pro Football Focus, he's about a third of the time an inline tight end, a third of the time a slot receiver, a third of the time an outside receiver, which is, again, extremely rare at that position. So, I mean, I don't need to tell Falcons fans, I don't need to tell you that he's like a versatile guy. Of course, everybody knows that. I do think he's probably the favorite to lead the team in targets. I wouldn't be surprised if he leads the team in yards and Drake London potentially catches more passes than Kyle Pitts, because I think, kind of counterintuitively, they might. I just can't wait. I mean, I honestly can't wait to see, even just in preseason. Maybe Arthur Smith doesn't show us much in preseason, but I can't wait to see the first couple weeks where we're going to get these guys, the most snaps. I think there are scenarios where Kyle Pitts takes more snaps as a pure outside receiver than Drake London does. I think also the inverse could be true. So really, I have no idea. Of course, the controversy shaking the nation is that I refuse to chart Kyle Pitts for reception perception because he is nominally listed as a tight end. I mean, hey, he's out there at tight end U, right? He's not out there at wide receiver U. So I'm taking all the little things I can because, of course, with reception perception, I profile over 70 receivers every offseason now on the site at this point, receptionperception.com, including prospects, including some absolute goofball receivers. I mean, Kendrick Bourne is on the docket for the Patriots this year to get charted at some point. So, but I've never done tight ends. You and I have been doing this long enough where I remember, folks telling me back when I first started reception perception, well, when are you gonna do Jordan Reed? When are you gonna do that type of stuff? It's like, well, he was the exception, but not really obviously Kyle Pitts is to a totally different degree. So maybe by next year I have to, bend to the will of the people or find some creative way to finally include Kyle Pitts. It's just, obviously with the snaps at tight end, it's very different when you're building a historical success rate versus coverage database, the big dork stuff that nobody really cares about. There's also just the pure lack of hours in the day to start including tight ends. But yeah, I mean, I'm really excited about Kyle Pitts. I think he's just so unique, so explosive. I think he is going to be one of the most fascinating players. And from a fantasy perspective, I'm totally, I don't think you're ever going to get I mentioned earlier that there are some folks that are kind of disappointed by his year one production. I don't think that's ever going to be reflected in any sort of ADP discount. You're going to have, if you want Kyle Pitts, you're going to have to draft him pretty early. You're going to, after the tight ends like Travis Kelce and Mark Andrews, I think I think I'll probably rank him ahead of George Kittle this year. I think from a pure projection standpoint, I think he's going to project out better given some of the changes that are going to go on in the 49ers offense. So, I mean, you're never going to get an ADP discount on Kyle Pitts, but I do think he can have a really big season. I'm with you. I think he probably leads the team in targets. And then from a catches standpoint, it's just going to come down to usage. How are they going to use these guys? Which I don't think we'll get any indication about that really, from a solid perspective until the games are actually played. But of course, we'll be following, all of us that want to know this stuff will be following your work, everyone else that kind of keeps their eyes on the Falcons. What do you think? How do you think these guys are going to get deployed?
I was literally talking about this the other day, the last couple of days. We're talking about wide receivers, talking about tight ends, talking about how Anthony Ferkser being more of that, I'm calling him Swole Beasley as that big slot for them. And then sort of how does that impact Drake London? How does that impact Kyle Pitts? Sort of, are we going to see more inline Kyle Pitts this year? How does that affect his, it's all so much up in the air. So I'm in the same boat as you. I'm very intrigued, curious, and I don't get very excited about anything Falcons related anymore after they burned me a couple of years ago. As every Falcon fan got burned a couple of years ago. But this is one of those things that I am legitimately excited to see what happens. So your guess is as good as mine. That's basically why I'm asking you. Like, maybe you have a little bit more insight into it than
I feel like, from an ideal perspective, I know that there's a lot of efficiency metrics that show he was really good against man coverage last year. I mean, I think that's great. Like, you can throw him out there as the starting X receiver and kind of get away with it. The thing that kind of bugged me a little bit last year was that I thought, from like a pure defensive alignment perspective, it's some of the work I've done with reception perception bears this out. It's so much easier to double cover like an outside X receiver. It's so much easier to dedicate that extra defensive attention that way. I feel like in an ideal world, you'd probably want him, Kyle Pitts being, you'd probably want him to really develop as like not a pure inline tight end. I mean, nobody from a receiving perspective, these tight ends really does that anymore. He's not going to be like a freaking Jason Witten type of player. You don't want that at all, of course. But I do think like having him be maybe more, I don't know, like maybe more 50-50 inline and then slot would be ideal. And then you can have a legitimate guy in maybe Bryan Edwards as your X receiver. And then you have Drake London as sort of like a movable piece, as the flanker that sometimes goes inside. You use more condensed formations. It gets a variety of guys, sort of more free releases. I think that probably and I'm not saying this just so I can have less people arguing that he's a wide receiver, not a tight end, so I've got to chart him next year or whatever. I think probably from an ideal perspective, like a mismatch perspective, and really because once Calvin Ridley was gone, it was like, well, defenses have nobody else in this receiving core to care about except Kyle Pitts. And I sort of think it became easier for defenses to roll that coverage that way, to double cover him as that outside receiver, than it would be if he was a tight end or a big slot receiver. So I think from an ideal perspective, that's what I'd like to see. But again, these guys are also multiple. It's going to be crazy and fun to watch.
Yeah, well, I know someone who out there who does want to see you break down Kyle Pitts on reception perception is his agent, so that in 4 years,
right,
they can get paid as a wide receiver. So he can sit here and like, look, we're 78th percentile or 90th percentile versus man coverage when he's lined up wide. So I know they're looking very interested into your work on Kyle Pitts.
Well, Kyle Pitts' agent can reach out to me. I will do it for a cut of like
a second contract,
a small percentage. I would do it for a very small percentage, like 0.5% of whatever he signs a second contract for. I'll do it for that. Not for the will of the people, but for more money. Yeah.
There you go. That's I think that's like six figures. 1.5%
exactly.
of his next contract is going to be like six figures. So, I hope you get it, Matt, and maybe
Probably
I can get a finder's fee a little bit of.
Yeah. Oh yeah. We'll talk offline.
Okay. All right. Last question I have for you, Matt. Sort of other fantasy guys that you're keeping your eyes on heading into the season. Cordero Patterson, I think, is one obvious candidate. What are your thoughts on what are your expectations for him? Can he sort of have a repeat of what he did last year? Are you keeping an eye on Tyler Allgeier as one of these other running backs? Marcus Mariota, Desmond Ridder, any of the quarterbacks, anybody else that you got your eyes on fantasy wise?
Well, I think the quarterbacks are interesting because in any sort of like super flex or two quarterback format, which there's a lot of leagues kind of moving to that super flex format. The folks at Underdog have like a super flex best ball tournament going on right now. Like, that's how much the format has made its way into sort of the mainstream culture of fantasy. It's like these quarterbacks are going to be relevant because, one, every quarterback is relevant when you're talking about a super flex format, and you get that additional option to start a second quarterback. And then additionally, both of these guys have rushing upside. Mariota, obviously, he's shown some juice when he's gotten out there for the Raiders. I think he'll be interesting, especially because these pass catchers are pretty intriguing. And I think Arthur Smith does create a lot of really positive looks for his quarterback. Like, we didn't get to see it sort of play out with Mariota in Tennessee, but I think there's a chance it could look better, or at least slightly better in this version with the Falcons, not to the same efficiency degree, certainly than what we got with Ryan Tannehill and A.J. Brown when those guys were popping off, and even Corey Davis there. But I think there's a chance that we could see like a junior version of that, which would make Marcus Mariota potentially interesting from a fantasy perspective. And Desmond Ridder too, if he gets out there and wins the job, or gets, when Marcus Mariota gets hurt, if he does get hurt, which has happened quite often, we'll see Ridder then too. And I think he would sort of be a very similar version. I thought those guys compared pretty favorably. And then the running backs, I'm gonna ask you a question again, because I think what's so fascinating about like Cordero Patterson is there was sort of multiple chapters in the Cordero Patterson experience last year, which I think is great for his real life impact to this Falcons team, that they can use him in so many different ways. From like a fantasy perspective, I think the biggest question with Patterson is which version are we going to get? Are we going to get like the hybrid wide receiver, running back, it's kind of gadget guy that we sort of got early in the season, when he was playing a decent bit of snaps out wide, in addition to working as a running back? Are we going to get the passing down back Cordero Patterson, which probably would be the best for his fantasy value? Or then are we going to get like sort of there was a chapter there where they tried to sort of use him as the base back, like the early down banger, and that didn't really work as well from a fantasy standpoint. So I think the key for Patterson is figuring out, going into the season, again, we have another like positional alignment question here with the Falcons. There's so many interesting players in this regard. Which version of Patterson is that going to be? And I think that's going to be the key to sort of projecting him. And then from the running back perspective, Tyler Allgeier, as you mentioned, is going to be really interesting. If he can sort of kind of capture some of that base back work. But I also wouldn't rule out a veteran like Damian Williams, if he's healthy, potentially earning some of that work as well. So finding out for Patterson, if there's going to be a complement, who that complement is going to be. I think ideally you want Allgeier or Damian Williams to emerge as an early down back, so that Patterson can be used in efficient ways in the passing game, because I think that's probably going to be the key to him working out from a fantasy perspective. But I think he's a very, very difficult player to rank going into the year without knowing for sure, what his role is going to be.
Yeah, I think ideally the Falcons would love Allgeier to be that guy. They would love him to be that base back, that grinder between the tackles, and be everything that Mike Davis wasn't necessarily last year. And Patterson can just be featured in the way that he was featured often last year, and where he shined last year, as that pass catching running back out of the backfield, whether it's taking a 5-yard check down and turning it into a 30-yard gain, taking a simple screen and making that a big play, or splitting out wide, lining up in the slot, and doing all the things he did as a pass catcher in that role. So I think that's what the Falcons hope and plan to have. That's their plan A. Obviously what we see this season will depend on various factors that are unknown at this time. Like, as like running the football, you kind of need to be, the game needs to be tied, or you need to have a lead if you want to lean on your running game. That was something that Arthur Smith was able to do quite a bit in Tennessee with Derrick Henry, of course. I don't know if he's going to have that amount of success here in Atlanta this year. And so we might see, that might lead to less of Tyler Allgeier and more of Patterson, the pass catcher, because the Falcons wind up, throwing the ball 65% of the time, or whatever the case may be. But I do expect Patterson, to pick up where he left off as a pass catcher and be that sort of versatile chess piece this upcoming season.
Yeah, I think we'll definitely, either way, we'll see him as a versatile guy. I do think in an ideal scenario for Patterson, I almost, like you said, the Falcons are probably not going to be good enough to be in very many run heavy game scripts. So a guy like Allgeier, in a hypothetical world where he's the base back, the grinder, like you said, those guys typically don't interest me much in from a fantasy angle, because he's probably not going to get a ton of carries generally, because they're not going to be in very many favorable game scripts, and he's probably going to leave the field for Cordero Patterson from a passing game perspective in the red zone, right? Like even as the early down back, you're probably not going to project him for very many touchdowns, just given how good this team's going to be. So I almost don't really care if it's Allgeier or if it's anyone else. You just, from a Patterson perspective, you want somebody else to emerge as that back, because I think then we have more ways for Patterson to be used efficiently, even if he does sacrifice some of the early down carries. From a fantasy angle, you don't really care much about that.
That's fair. Well, Matt, I appreciate you coming on, talking fantasy, talking Pitts, talking Edwards, Drake London, and much, much more. Looking forward to this upcoming season. Let the listeners know, what type of stuff you have coming for them this summer, when camps open up and as the season goes on, both at Yahoo and for Reception Perception.
Reception Perception, you will not find a Kyle Pitts profile. If you find one, then Aaron and I's plan to to get an argument from his agent who worked, and I've probably retired at that point based on my 0.5% of his contract. No, but yeah, so there's already a Drake London prospect profile up there. I think Bryan Edwards is a guy that's going to go up at some point. There's his rookie year profile, but maybe his second year profile is one that we're looking at doing later on. But in the meantime, there's profiles on 60 plus players, from a college perspective and an NFL perspective. Our final big player drop, like with all the big time veterans like Cooper Kupp, all the bigger name players, is going to be on July 1st. So the database and the player profile pages will be fully stocked. You mentioned the tiers. Those will be coming, I'm hoping, earlier than ever this year, sometime in July after I get back from the vacation and can bang out all the projections. So a lot of cool stuff coming, and definitely just make sure to check out the Yahoo Fantasy Football Forecast. Will be at a daily 5 days a week once the season gets closer.
There you go. So highly recommend the tiers. Now, if you happen to play in the same league that I play in, then just ignore the tiers. It's not going to do any good for you. But for everybody else, definitely highly recommend those tiers. It will definitely help your drafting so that you won't have to, be scrambling in week 3 to have to pick up this running back because such and such wound up disappointing, from your drafts or whatever the case may be. So, Matt, I really, again, appreciate you. As you say, we go back many, many years. I think the first time you came on a podcast was Falcon Central Radio back in like 2013 to come on talk about the Panthers and some Falcons-Panthers matchup or whatever, talking about Cam Newton or whatever we were talking about back then, Jonathan Stewart or whoever. So appreciate you for sticking with me this long and coming on and sharing more insight into these Falcons weapons. And we'll see if, 13 months from now, we're looking at a completely different group of skill players like we were, 13 months ago. So I appreciate you, my friend.
Appreciate it, man. Thanks for having me.
So, guys, that will do it for us here. Thanks, Matt Harmon, for coming on talking about these subjects. We'll see what's what a little bit later in the summer with fantasy stuff. Moving forward, tomorrow's, of course, we'll be talking about the offensive line. We'll do our training camp preview. Probably won't go as in depth as we've done with some of these other positions, just because of the sheer number of offensive linemen. But we'll try to get to the big storylines, the key camp battles, and maybe we'll do like a rapid fire where I do like 2 sentences on all 15 guys at the end of the episode. So that will be on deck for tomorrow. And then next week, we have something great in store for you guys. Alan Stirk is making his triumphant return to the podcast, a former co-host here on Locked On Falcons, as well as a former co-host back in the days when it was called the Falcons podcast, back at falcons.com days, RIP. And we're going to be doing a new series, right? 2 years ago, we did a fun little trivia series, but it's going to be the two of us. We're going to do an all-time draft series. That's kind of the tentative name for it. And we will be basically going back and forth, kind of doing a fantasy style draft, picking our favorite Falcons, our top Falcons to build the best possible offense and defense. I tried to convince Alan of, doing a special teams breakdown, but he was like, no, it does not matter. And I wound up crying in the corner when he said that, much to my chagrin. But yeah, we'll do offense and defense. It'll be a 4-part series next week, beginning on July 4th on Monday, airing for the rest of the week. And then we'll see what happens later in the week. I'm hoping to have a guest on for that. But if not, then we might wind up just doing a Q&A. So offensive line preview this week. We'll do another episode at the end of this week, kind of wrapping up sort of the big thoughts surrounding the offense. Now that we've gone through all the offensive training camp previews, that will be on Friday this week. And then next week, we will kick off with that all-time draft series with Alan Stirk. So look forward to some great content here. Still going 5 days a week, all the way up to training camp. And then after that series, that's when we'll start that all-time draft series. We'll start the defensive camp previews later in the month of July. So guys, I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon. I hope you tune in for the rest of the great content that we're bringing here on this illustrious podcast. But that will do it for us here. Appreciate it. Till then.